Hello everybody and welcome back. Noxy here. So the build is obviously completely done. The actual build video itself is a bit longer than I expected, so it's just going to be broken up into multiple parts. Probably about 6 parts total at about 20 minutes apiece. Maybe 7 parts just to kind of trim down the others, but we'll see. But without further ado, here's part 1. So starting them off, we are going to unbox the motherboard and put the Ryzen 9 5950X into its socket. We'll also work on getting the CPU water block on and the RAM in place as well, as I believe the NVMe is in this first video. So for the motherboard, we're working with the MSI Meg Unify. It is a hefty board, a very sturdy, very solid board. You can feel the build quality when you actually hold the actual motherboard. It has quite a bit of weight to it, unlike a lot of other motherboards I've used in the past. So it has a lot of weight, and one of the big reasons I chose this is because it was already Ryzen 9 ready. I knew I was going to be using two 6900 XTs, and I was using 128 gigabyte worth of RAM. So I knew I needed to have it compatible for 128. I wanted a 2.5 gig LAN port in the back, which it has. It's already ready for the 5950X, being the X570 series. And because it's an X570 series with the Ryzen 9 mixed with the 6900 XTs, I'm going to be getting an extra performance boost out of it. That's something AMD's linked in right with all of their software, and it's already set and ready to go with MSI's firmware on their motherboard, so I didn't really have to do anything once I booted it up. Now, as you can see, this CPU here is the 5950X, something I had been waiting quite a while for, and I was lucky enough to score without killing me. So, biggest thing is right here I'm checking for the actual indicator as to where to line it up. And I'm just going to place it in the socket and then set down the lever, and it's locked into place. Very easy to do, very easy to install, and then we're going to have to remove some of these brackets here that are pre-installed on the motherboards so that we can install our CPU cooler. Now for the CPU cooler, we're going to be using an EKWB quantum velocity block. So it is an RGB block that'll plug in right to the RGB header on my motherboard, and I've always had great success with EK blocks. I've always been a big fan of them, and it is a plexi block, so you'll be able to see all the fluid right through it, which I'm really quite happy about. Now, one of the first steps is actually having all your mounting screws set. So we're going to get all the mounting screws set, and you can see them. Kind of hard to get a look at the detail, but we set all our mounting screws for the water block, and they're actually going to screw into a plate that's behind the motherboard, which you can't see right now, but you've got to line that up first, put your washers on, and then you'll put your actual mounting screws on. Once you've got the mounting screws on, it's pretty easy to line up. You put your CPU block on after you've put thermal paste on your CPU, of course. Now, don't pull a Verge video and just slather it with thermal paste. That's absolutely unnecessary. And actually, further in this video, you'll see how much thermal paste came on my GPU. The first GPU I did was actually far worse than my second GPU, so I only recorded my second GPU to save time. My first GPU was just covered in thermal paste. So before I put the thermal paste in, I'm going around and actually hitting each screw and tightening it one by one to make sure I don't add any undue stress to the board. And then I'm going to put about a rice to pea-sized dot of thermal paste on my actual Ryzen CPU. Very easy to do. At this point, I'm making sure everything's lined up, so I'm ready to go. Put a tiny amount of thermal paste on, and then I'll put the block on as well as the springs, and then I will actually screw the block on. The springs are pretty necessary so that you don't actually crush your board, and you give a little bit of resistance so you can't over tighten things. So the springs go on, block goes on, easy peasy. So here's our block, here's our springs, and then the screws will go through each spring. Very, like I said, very easy to do. You want to start one at a time. Don't finish a screw. So start a screw, get it going, go to the next one, get it going. That way you're evenly distributing the pressure across the CPU and motherboard. As you can see, I struggled a little bit with one of the screws. It didn't want to thread properly, and I had to keep going back to all the other screws. And then I tightened them all into place. Hand tight is fine. You don't have to worry about cranking them like crazy. So I go until they just stop moving, hit each screw back and forth, and then I'm good to go. And the block is on. And then from there I just simply add in, I'll add in my RAM later. I think I actually add in RAM once I mount it to my motherboard tray, and that's when I do all my NVMEs. So here we have the GPU deconstruction. We've got to take off the base plate, all the heat sinks, and the fans. And to do that, there's a lot of screws you've got to undo on the base plate first, and then you've got a couple that are hidden within the board that are kind of hard to get to. So it does provide an extra screw in the kit that I got. I can't remember exactly what the company is for the block, for my GPU blocks. They did come from China, and they had 0 instructions. Well, that's not true. They had instructions for installing a monoblock to a motherboard, which does not help me whatsoever. So I kind of had to figure it out myself, and then I went from there. That's why I recorded the second one. Now, right now, there are 2 screws on the I/O part of the GPU that you have to remove so that you can pull the cooler off. And then you pull the cooler off, comes off pretty easy, and you can already start to see how much thermal paste there is. So in my right hand, now out of visibility, was the actual cooler with heat sinks. There are more heat sinks on the actual card, and there are more screws attaching the backplate to the actual card. So we're going to unscrew everything. There's a couple holding the last heatsink onto the actual board, and then there's several screws holding the actual base plate onto the card itself. So we're going to undo that and then just pull everything apart. It's pretty easy to do, although the second heatsink did take a little bit more work. As you can see, I'm kind of wiggling at them there, and then I end up stop wiggling and I end up just pulling off the base plate. And then out of frame, I'm able to get a slightly better grip on things, and I'm actually able to remove the remainder of the heat sinks that I need to. Once I've got these heat sinks removed, I just put them aside. I've got them actually boxed up in the original boxing just in case I need them in the future. And now you can see all the thermal pads hidden under all that heatsink. The thermal pads covering the VRM chips and the MOSFETs. So everything's covered with thermal pads, so I'm going to have to clean all this up. So I sped that up mostly out of convenience, along with a lot of the screwing, because that was just, it takes longer than you need to. So clean everything up, and then I have a microfiber cloth where I'm going to actually go through and make sure I thoroughly cleaned all the thermal paste off. As you can see, I'm having to go through on the actual GPU processor. I'm having to go back multiple times because there's just so much thermal paste that's even gotten a bit into the socket. So I have to really work on cleaning that up. I don't want to leave thermal paste there. I know I'm unable to get all of it, but I get the vast majority of it. Go through, clean up where all the thermal pads were, just remove as much of the grease as I can with that microfiber cloth, and then I'm going to go through and add new thermal pads exactly where all the previous thermal pads were. So because I had no instructions, there was no clear indication of where I had to go. Thankfully, I've done water cooling, I've done GPU blocks in the past, so I am familiar with what I'm doing. And then it was just cutting all my thermal pads to size, putting a bit of thermal paste on my GPU processor, and I actually do a little bit more on my GPU processor than I do on my CPU, on my 5950X. So on this, I add, there's smaller drops, but I add 2 smaller drops because the processor's not actually it's not square like a standard processor is. A CPU is. It's rectangular. So to make sure I get even distribution, I add a couple of smaller ones right next to each other to make my life a little bit easier, and they're smaller so it doesn't spread too far, and they're relatively close so I get a nice even spread overall. So making sure I've got all my thermal pads cut properly and adding them back into their designated spots. It does take a little bit of time and patience, so if you're doing this, expect to put some time into it. It does not happen overnight. Well, I mean, since I've been used to doing this, it took me, I'm gonna say, probably about 35 minutes to do this block. It didn't take terribly long at all, but that's mostly due to the fact that this is the second block I did. I had already done one block, and I already knew what to go through. As you can see, I'm going from one step to the other, just hammering things out. I already knew what I was doing. Thankfully, I didn't want to record the first block just because I knew it would take quite a bit more time, and then I've got to edit it. And I knew doing just one block after I've already gained the experience on this new type of GPU and this new style water block, I'd be good to go. So I've got the last of my thermal pads on -1. There's one that's going to actually go on the other side of the card between the backplate and the actual card itself. So removing the actual plastic from these thermal pads can be a pain in the ass. So I go through great lengths for some of them. I do struggle, use my tweezers for some and my fingers for other. So just based on what's working, what's not working for each strip. Make sure I've got all the plastic pieces off. And then once I've got them off, I can actually put the thermal paste on. I had to kind of cut that clip a little bit based on my giant head was covering everything. So you see me put the thermal paste on, and then you see it on there because I had to cut a lot of that out. And then we go on to add the actual GPU block on, get that lined up, and then we'll have to flip it over. We get it flipped over, and then we can actually screw that block on, and then we'll be able to screw the back plate on from there. I think at this point I was mostly looking for thermal paste. Pretty sure I misplaced it. Trying to do everything and film everything, I definitely, lost track of a lot of different items. Not everything went exactly to plan. As I had initially started it in my parts video where I was discussing all the different parts. So I did have to make some deviations, like having to pretty much wing it on the GPU blocks. But, I didn't really have much of a problem once I got it taken care of. We got the GPU block on. It wasn't, really much of a big deal. I was happy with how clean they look, and it's a very clean looking block. I had heard some rumors that you've got to be very careful with the blocks that say they're for the 6800 and 6900 XTs, as apparently they only fit the 6800s. Mine was one of those cards, but everything lined up perfectly for me. And I was quite excited for that. So I do have a little bit more thermal paste to clean up here on the back side of the card, so I'm going to take care of that. Get that all cleaned up. I'm using my tweezers just because it makes it a little bit easier to actually clean everything up. So we get it all scraped off, and then I'll go through with the microfiber again and just try and clean as much of it up as I can. And then we add in that last thermal pad and really start getting everything screwed in, which isn't, that's no big deal. So get the rest of this all cleaned up. Don't want any extra thermal paste on there. In this case, just get that nice and clean, and then we can start getting the rest of everything screwed in. The water block. That is, you get the water block all set, and then you move to the back plate. Now on here there are spring-loaded screws, so you want to make sure that is actually going over where the GPU processor is. There are 4 main ones that need to be taken care of. You can see I'm lining those up as it right now. They line up actually into the actual water block, so it's not the same place where I took that X cross area on the top side of the GPU. That's not where I took those off from. So there's screw holes next to each one, and you do the same thing. Get each one started, and then just go around and cycle through all of them until there is until they're all even and tight. You don't have to crank them super tight, just until they stop turning. Don't overdo them, and then go again one to the other and tighten one up at a time, and then go from there. This will save you, quite a bit of time and headache. And it evenly distributes all the pressure across the actual GPU core, which is really what you want. You don't want to put undue pressure on one side versus another side. So this keeps everything nice and evenly distributed. And then I'm going to go ahead and screw in the rest of the actual water block so that it's completely on there. I don't have to worry about it just being held on by a couple of screws. And then from there, have a difficult time with some of the screws, unfortunately. No big deal. It does happen. But once that's done, we just get to the back plate. And then once we're done with the back plate, I do believe that's really all we had planned for just this first intro video. Just doing the water blocks, because the overall video was so long. Like an hour and 20 minutes. It has to be cut down. So we're just doing the base installation and water blocks. Next video, We'll get into motherboard to motherboard tray because it's all modular. We'll get the RAM installed, and then we'll get my NVMEs, my M.2s. We'll get all those installed. So right here we've got the backplate. I do like how it looks. It's so the GPU, they're Bykski, but I really like it's clean, it's minimalistic, and that's what I really like about this particular block. Now they are supposed to be RGB blocks as well, and I've been unable to get those to work. I do have a control panel in the block back for them that I'm just gonna have to try and figure out, because what directions I did have, yes, they were for a CPU block, but they're also all in Chinese with absolutely no English. So, made my life even harder. So we get all this screwed back in. Secondary videos going to be motherboard mounting, RAM, my NVMEs, I believe my power supply, getting the power supply into the case, and then we'll go from there. We'll see what we've got. But thanks for coming by. I appreciate y'all stopping by. Don't forget to like and subscribe to stick up to date with all of the videos that I have going, and we'll see you next time.